As soon as you hear elites of any sort, writers, politicians, business people, bureaucrats, economists, whatever, saying that we're in a situation where everything's inevitable, you know we're in deep trouble. This is a rewriting of an old cliche. There are only two inevitable things, and those are death and sex, not taxes. It's a very, very badly thought out idea, because there are lots of people who don't pay taxes, who have a lot of money. So it is not inevitable. Economic systems do not last a long time. There is no such thing as an economic system which is an inevitability which will be there forever. History does not end. Some guy who's a tenured professor announces that history ends and everyone buys the book. I'm standing around saying, this guy ought to be thrown out of the university. I mean, he's intellectually incompetent because he doesn't know anything about history. It doesn't end. And he's still there, and they're still hiring him to give opinions on what's happening. Anyway, what can I say? I don't know how to harm him. Because he harms himself and will be looked upon, of course, as one of the jokes of the late 20th century and the early 21st century. It'll be looked back on as one of the figures, fools of the time, if you like.
But how does it feel to be able to say, I told you so?
Oh, really good. Not that you want other people to suffer, but coming out of a kind of Anglican Protestant background, when I rewrote put a conclusion on the book, because it really didn't have a proper conclusion, and I felt really good about it. That finally I was able to say exactly there. I told you what was going to happen, and here it's happened. And all my family, my friends, all said, "For God's sake, John, don't ever say I told you so." It's so looked down upon in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I said, well, on the other hand, it's kind of fun. And but the tragedy is that the real tragedy is that, first of all, the ideas at the basis of globalism. I'm not saying everything wasn't wrong with globalism. There's lots of good things. I mean, protectionism isn't a blanket answer to anything. Free trade isn't a blanket answer to anything. I mean, none of these are blanket answers. But some good stuff came out of globalism. It was a way to turn around a corner, which was very difficult in the early 1970s. But the fact of the matter is that you could see that it wasn't going to work out. You could see, the middle classes getting squeezed. You could see rich-poor divides. You could see that we were producing more goods than we needed while we were still calling for more growth. Why call for more growth when you're in surplus? What does that mean? So that it was obvious that it was going to end relatively badly. It was pretty obvious to me after 95 and the creation of the WTO that after that moment, nothing big and positive happened for the globalist movement. And instead of that, this rather ramshackle bus, globalism, going down an increasingly, I'm trying to use a really bad cliche here, but going down a kind of increasingly rocky road, and then, the mirrors fell off, and one of the tires came off, and the windows started breaking, and then they couldn't get into fourth gear, and then et cetera, and the thing just started falling apart, the meltdown in Asia, and so on and so on. So that by 2001, it was clear that it was over. But of course, you've got an elite who are entirely trained to run this inevitable system for the rest of time. So they have absolutely no idea how to do anything else. They just say, oh, you're against globalism. I said, no, I'm not. I'm not for it or against it. But the point is what you're doing doesn't work. That's the point. It's not an attack on God. You think this is God. It isn't God. It's just an economic theory. That's all it is. It's not a big deal. Don't get so overexcited about it. Just say, look, you tried this economic theory out. It's had a couple of decades. Some of it's worked. Most of it hasn't worked. And now we have to do something else. But instead of that, we waited and waited. I said by about 2000, we'd gone into a vacuum, which is what you go into at the end of a system before you go into the next system. And when you're in this vacuum, vacuum's the wrong word, but you're in this period, this no man's land or no woman's land. And it's an era of disorder. And it's that moment when interesting people say, okay, where do we go next? Instead of that, what everybody said was, no, everything's okay. We were reassured. That's that managerial thing, reassure them, keep them calm, otherwise the peasants will run amok. And, they were so frightened that you'd run amok that they calmed you down. And the result is we just sat around until the crisis hit us. And now you're all in debt. You spent 30 to 40 years making sacrifices to get out of debt, and now they've massively indebted you again. For what purpose?
But the really question for us is who can we blame?
Really?
Could we blame the Americans? But then we had to blame the Scottish banks.
Right.
Suddenly the Scottish banks, who would have thought? And then the Icelanders. We had no idea it was the Icelanders' fault.
I don't think you need to blame. I think the people you need to blame are... if I were going to make a list of blame, which is sort of pointless, but
fun on a Saturday.
But fun. No, it has some utility, actually. The first group I would blame would be the departments of economics. Because that's where the ideas come from that justify...
universities.
In the university. I mean, that sounds so boring. You'd rather that I blamed somebody you knew the name of and could identify that you could go out and spit on or something. But the fact is that these ideas, which lie at the base of what governments and private sector people will do, come out of those departments of economics. And they carried out, between the 70s and in the 70s, 80s, 90s, a kind of intellectual cleansing of alternate thought, so that they became places where 95% of the economists thought the same thing. At this very moment, they are teaching your children, or if your children, you, exactly the same ideas they were teaching 10 years ago, which are precisely the ideas which have brought the crisis. They haven't changed a thing. Why would they change it? They're the custodians of truth, right? So that inflexibility and incapacity to engage in debate and to treat economics as a place of discussion rather than a place of truth, where you eliminate people who disagree with you, that is really a problem. Because if you're a prime minister and you say, well, what else could we do? You turn to the economists, and they're all saying the same thing. Even on the left or the right, they're all saying the same. Number two, I think you can blame the business schools, because the business schools are the kind of unthinking utilitarian application of the departments of economics. So they just sort of roll on. And, of course, they believe in common control. That's what business schools believe in. So they, in a way, again, eliminate the possibility of discussion. Of course, they're not about risk. They're not about the public good. They're not about ownership. They're about management. So they, in a way, have created this enormous block of false stability, which makes it hard to see that action is required. Then I'd blame the consultancy industry, which, of course, is a child of the departments of economics and the business schools. And then after that, I don't know. Who would you blame?
I don't know. I mean, but what the banks?
Well, but the banks, you see, are an outcome, to the extent that they're part of the problem, they're an outcome of the first three. Well, we'll get to that in a second. But, I mean, the Federal Reserves, I think you have to kind of look at one by one. I think my impression was, in the late 90s, was that most of the Federal Reserves were pretty good. I mean, yours was saying constantly off the record, which is what they were supposed to do at that time. They were saying constantly to the politicians and to the World Bank and so on, they were saying, look, this is a catastrophe. This is not going to work.